Rockford, Michigan, was the kind of town where people still waved to each other on the street, where parents let their children ride bikes until sunset, and where doors were left unlocked without a second thought. Crime was rare, and when it did happen, it was usually nothing more than a minor break-in or a dispute between neighbors that never escalated beyond raised voices. It was the last place anyone would expect to wake up to the news that a woman had been murdered in her own home, not just killed, but brutally, viciously attacked in a way that suggested the kind of rage reserved for the deepest of betrayals. The call came in late in the evening. A woman was found unresponsive in her home. That was how the dispatcher phrased it at first, a sterile, almost routine choice of words. It wasn't until the first officers arrived on the scene that the reality of what had happened set in. The victim was Renee Pajal, a 41-year-old mother of three, a nurse, a teacher, a woman known for her kindness and her willingness to help others. Her body was discovered in her bedroom, covered in stab wounds. Not just a few, not even a dozen, more than 50. It was clear from the moment the first responder stepped into that house that this was not a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. Earlier that day, Renee's friends had tried to call her. She had been recovering from surgery, a major operation, one that left her weak and unable to move easily. Just days before, she had done something remarkable, something few would have even considered. She had donated one of her kidneys to save the life of a man she had never met, the father of one of her students. That was the kind of person she was, selfless, always putting others before herself, never expecting anything in return. But today she wasn't answering her phone. At first, no one panicked. Maybe she was asleep. Maybe the painkillers had left her too drowsy to respond. Maybe her phone had died. But as the hours passed, the unease grew. Something wasn't right. By evening, a friend decided to stop by her house. It was a quick drive, one she had made dozens of times before. Renee's car was still in the driveway, parked just as it had been the day before. The house looked normal from the outside. No broken windows, no signs of a struggle, just the soft hum of crickets in the background and the warm glow of the street lights flickering against the pavement. But as she stepped closer, she noticed something. The front door wasn't completely closed. She hesitated, debating whether to call out or simply walk in. Maybe Renee had stepped outside for a moment and forgotten to shut it all the way. Maybe one of the kids had left it open the last time they visited. But deep down, she already knew that something was wrong. The door creaked slightly as she pushed it open, revealing the dimly lit interior of the house. It was quiet, too quiet. She called Renee's name, her voice echoing slightly in the stillness. No answer. A shiver ran down her spine. The house felt empty in a way that didn't feel right, like the kind of emptiness that comes not from absence, but from something much worse. She took a few cautious steps inside, her fingers instinctively reaching for the light switch. The living room was neat, untouched, the kind of place that suggested nothing was amiss. But then she took another step forward, and that was when she smelled it. Blood. It was a thick, metallic scent. Something she had never encountered before but recognized instantly. Her breath caught in her throat as she moved toward the hallway, each step heavier than the last. When she reached the bedroom, she didn't need to open the door all the way to see what was inside. A single glance was enough to change her life forever. Renee was lying on the bed, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, the sheets beneath her soaked through with blood. The walls, the mattress, even the floor. It was everywhere. There was so much of it that for a brief moment, her mind refused to process what she was seeing. The wounds were deep, jagged, erratic, as if whoever had done this hadn't just wanted to kill her, but had wanted to destroy her. The knife had entered her body again and again, leaving behind a scene of pure, unrelenting violence. The scream that tore from her throat didn't even sound human. Her vision blurred as she stumbled backward, nearly falling over as she fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking too badly to dial at first. When she finally managed to press 911, her voice came out in a broken sob. "She's dead. Oh my God, she's dead. There's blood everywhere. Please send someone. Please." Within minutes, the street outside was flooded with flashing red and blue lights. Officers moved quickly, securing the perimeter, marking off the house as a crime scene. Neighbors gathered in hushed whispers, their faces etched with shock and confusion. How could this have happened? Who could have done this? And more importantly, why? One of the first detectives to step inside took a slow, measured look around the house, his eyes sweeping over every detail. There were no signs of forced entry, no windows broken, no locks tampered with. That meant one thing. Renee had known her killer. She had let them in. She had trusted them. The detective stepped into the bedroom, his expression unreadable as he took in the sight of the lifeless woman sprawled across the bed. He had worked homicides for years, had seen bodies in all states of death, but something about this one unsettled him more than most. This wasn't just a murder. This was something deeper, something personal. And then he noticed something small, almost imperceptible, near the doorframe. A tiny smudge, dark and barely noticeable against the pale paint. He reached for a swab, collecting the sample carefully before signaling to the forensic team. A single drop of blood. Not much, but enough. If they were lucky, it might just tell them who had been in that house besides Renee. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the murmurs of a town that had never seen violence like this before. Somewhere in the growing crowd, people whispered theories, their minds already racing to find explanations. Was it a stranger? A home invasion gone wrong? Or was it someone closer to home? As the last of the forensic team packed up for the night, the detective stood at the doorway, glancing back at the darkened house. A part of him already knew the truth, even if he couldn't prove it yet. This wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't a robbery or a crime of opportunity. Someone had wanted Renee dead, and they had made sure she suffered before they were done. The night air was heavy with the scent of rain, the ground still damp from an earlier drizzle, leaving the pavement glistening under the glow of flashing police lights. A crowd had formed along the street, neighbors wrapped in jackets and hushed murmurs, their expressions a mix of shock and unease. No one had expected something like this to happen here, in a town where crime was little more than a forgotten bicycle or the occasional stolen package from a front porch. But now, something had shattered that illusion, something far worse than anyone could have imagined. The police tape that stretched across the front yard of the Pajol home might as well have been a dividing line between the town, as it had been before tonight, and the town it had become now. Inside the house, the crime scene was eerily silent. The forensic team moved carefully through each room, their gloved hands brushing over surfaces, collecting fibers, swabbing for traces of DNA, searching for anything that might tell them who had done this and why. The bedroom remained untouched since the first responders had arrived, save for the careful placement of evidence markers lining the bed, the nightstand, the floor, anywhere the blood had landed. The mattress was saturated, the deep red staining every inch of fabric, and the walls bore the same brutal pattern. Renee hadn't just been attacked, she had been slaughtered. Detective David Monroe stood in the doorway, his arms crossed tightly against his chest. He had seen his fair share of violent crime scenes before, had walked through homes where families had been torn apart by moments of uncontrollable rage, had stood over victims who never saw death coming. But something about this was different. This wasn't the work of an amateur. The sheer number of stab wounds, the methodical but personal nature of the attack, told him that this wasn't random. This was rage, but it wasn't impulsive. It was controlled. Someone had wanted Renee dead, but more than that, they had wanted her to suffer. The unsettling part was the lack of struggle. The medical examiner had already noted that there were no significant defensive wounds, no broken nails, no bruises on her arms that suggested she had fought back. That meant one of two things. Either she had been unconscious before the attack began, or she had been taken completely by surprise. Monroe's gaze drifted toward the doorway, where a thin streak of red had been marked with a fluorescent light. The killer had left a trace behind, just enough blood smeared against the frame to suggest that they had brushed against it while leaving. A crime scene tech approached him, holding up a clear evidence bag. Inside was a single latex glove, partially crumpled, the tip of one finger still tinged red. "Found this near the bushes outside," the tech said. "Could be nothing. Could be everything." Monroe nodded, taking the bag and holding it up against the light. If there was DNA inside, if there was even a trace of skin cells that didn't belong to Renee, then they had their first real lead. Until then, they were grasping at shadows. The house itself was a puzzle, too intact to suggest a robbery, too clean to hint at a break-in gone wrong. The front door had been unlocked when the first officer arrived. No signs of forced entry, no broken locks, nothing to suggest someone had struggled to get inside. That meant whoever had done this had been let in. Monroe clenched his jaw at the thought. Renee had known her killer. She had trusted them enough to open the door, to turn her back, to make herself vulnerable in the last moments of her life. Out on the street, the murmurs of the gathered crowd were growing louder as the news spread. The small town of Rockford had never experienced a crime like this, and now, standing beneath the cold glow of streetlights, people were beginning to ask the same questions the police were already wrestling with. Who had done this? Why had it happened here? And more chillingly, was the person responsible still among them, watching? The morning brought little relief. The forensic team worked through the night, processing samples, documenting every inch of the scene. But by the time the sun rose, no definitive answers had been found. The detectives' team gathered at the station, drinking stale coffee and poring over their notes, trying to form a picture out of a collection of disjointed fragments. Monroe flipped through the file in front of him, studying Renee's background. A well-respected nurse, a dedicated mother, a woman who had, just days before, undergone surgery to donate a kidney to a man she barely knew. It was the kind of selfless act that made her murder even more incomprehensible. Then there was the matter of her personal life. She had been divorced and not on good terms. The battle for custody had been bitter, the financial settlements tense. Had that played a role in what happened? Monroe underlined the name of her ex-husband, a man who had, by all accounts, been struggling in the aftermath of the split. Was he the kind of person who would do this, or was he simply the easiest person to suspect? The first round of interviews started that afternoon. Friends and colleagues painted the same picture of Renee: compassionate, hardworking, the kind of person who went out of her way to help others. But beneath that, a different detail emerged. Several people mentioned that, in the weeks before her death, she had seemed anxious, on edge. She had spoken in vague terms about worrying something bad was going to happen. She hadn't elaborated, brushing it off when asked. But now, in hindsight, those words felt like a warning no one had recognized in time. Then came something else. One of her close friends hesitated before speaking, as if debating whether to say the words out loud. She mentioned feeling like someone was watching her, the woman finally said. She told me she would wake up at night and feel like there was someone outside standing near her house. She thought about getting cameras, but she never did. She said she was probably overreacting. Monroe exchanged a glance with his partner. It wasn't an overreaction. It was a sign. By the end of the day, there was still no suspect, no single piece of evidence that pointed definitively toward one person. But there was a direction. The killer had known Renee. That much was clear. The lack of forced entry, the level of violence, the personal nature of the attack. This wasn't random. Someone had been close to her. Someone had planned this. Monroe looked down at his notes, his pen tapping against the list of names they had gathered. Friends, co-workers, acquaintances. And then one name stood out. It was a name that had been repeated in careful whispers, with the same hesitant glance, the same nervous pause before speaking. A name that had been tied to tension, to resentment, to things left unsaid. Monroe exhaled slowly, closing the file. If they were going to find the person responsible, this was where they needed to start. He looked up at his team, his voice steady. Let's bring him in. The investigation had only just begun, but already there was a sense that this case was going to be different. The brutality of the crime alone suggested something deeply personal. It wasn't the work of a burglar caught off guard or a random act of violence. Someone had wanted Renee dead, and they had made sure of it in the most violent way possible. The police had gathered initial witness statements, secured the evidence, and begun the process of piecing together the final hours of Renee's life, searching for any detail that might explain why someone would want her gone. The first place they started was her routine. They needed to understand what her life looked like in the days before her murder, who she spoke to, what she did, and whether there had been any sign that she knew danger was coming. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Renee had been afraid, not in an obvious way, not in the way that led someone to file a police report or seek a restraining order, but in small, almost imperceptible ways that only made sense now in hindsight. One of her closest friends, a woman named Lisa, had been the first to mention it. Seated across from the detectives at the station, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, she struggled to find the right words. She was different, Lisa finally said. I don't know how else to explain it. Renee was always someone who kept things together, even when she was stressed. She didn't break easily, but these last few weeks, something was off. She was distracted, like her mind was always somewhere else. Detective Monroe leaned forward slightly. Did she say anything specific? Lisa hesitated. Not directly. I mean, I asked her a couple of times if she was okay. She'd laugh it off, tell me she was just tired or overwhelmed. But one night, maybe 2 weeks ago, we were sitting in her car outside my house just talking. And out of nowhere, she said something like, I feel like I'm being watched. Monroe's expression didn't change, but inside a small alarm went off. Did she say by who? No, Lisa admitted, rubbing her arms as if trying to shake off the memory. And when I asked, she just shrugged and said it was probably nothing. But it wasn't nothing. She looked scared. I should have pushed harder. She exhaled sharply, blinking back the tears that had started to form. I should have done something. Monroe let the silence settle for a moment before speaking again. Did she ever mention getting any threats? Lisa shook her head. Not outright, but she did say something that stuck with me. She said, if something happens to me, don't believe it was an accident. Monroe's jaw tightened. Those were the kinds of words that didn't just come from paranoia. They came from fear. It was becoming clear that whatever had happened to Renee hadn't come out of nowhere. There had been signs, subtle ones, but signs nonetheless. As the detectives continued speaking with those who had been closest to her, a pattern started to emerge. Renee had been in the middle of a long, drawn-out battle with her ex-husband, Michael Pagel. Their marriage had ended in an acrimonious divorce, filled with disputes over money, property, and most importantly, custody of their 3 children. To the outside world, Michael Pagel had once seemed like a mild-mannered teacher, someone who kept to himself and lived a quiet life. But those who knew Renee had a different story to tell. She was worried about him, said another friend, a former co-worker who had seen firsthand how much stress the divorce had caused her. He was angry about losing custody, really angry. She told me once that she didn't think he would ever hurt the kids, but that she wasn't so sure about herself. That uncertainty alone was enough to send a chill down Monroe's spine. Then came another revelation, one that made everything feel even more urgent. During a routine sweep of Renee's financial records, investigators discovered something alarming. Just months before her death, she had changed her life insurance policy, removing Michael as the beneficiary. Instead, she had designated her children, ensuring that if anything happened to her, they would be taken care of. It was a small but significant move, a move that, to the right person, might have seemed like a final betrayal. Monroe looked over the case notes again, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the file. There was no concrete evidence yet, but a picture was beginning to form. A bitter divorce, a man who had lost everything, his home, his financial stability, his children. A woman who had finally taken steps to cut him out of her life completely. And then just days before she was brutally murdered, she had done one last selfless act, donating her kidney to help a stranger. Whoever had killed Renee had known her well enough to be let inside. They had attacked her in a way that was violent, excessive, deeply personal. Everything pointed toward someone close to her. And Michael Pagel? He was about as close as it got. But suspicion wasn't enough. The detectives needed proof. Real, tangible evidence that connected him to the crime. The forensic team was still running tests on the blood smear found near the doorway and the latex glove discovered outside. If the DNA matched someone in the system, they would have their break. But there was another, more immediate way to start looking for answers. Michael Pagel needed to be questioned. Monroe closed the file, pushing back his chair. It was time to bring him in. The interview room at the Kent County Sheriff's Department was small and windowless, a dull gray space designed to make people feel uncomfortable. The walls absorbed sound, creating an eerie stillness, and the fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows across the table where Michael Pagel sat. He looked calm, almost indifferent, as if being questioned about the brutal murder of his ex-wife was nothing more than an inconvenience. His arms were crossed, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. Detective David Monroe sat across from him, a file open on the table, though he barely glanced at it. He already knew what was in it: years of legal battles, custody disputes, financial strain. It told the story of a man who had lost control of his life, and by all accounts resented every second of it. "Michael," Monroe began, his voice even, measured, "we appreciate you coming in." Michael barely nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "I don't see why I'm here. I already told the officers where I was that night." Monroe studied him for a moment before speaking again. "We're just trying to understand the last few weeks of Renee's life. You two had a history, a complicated one. We want to make sure we cover every angle." Michael exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Look, we were divorced. That was it. She got what she wanted, and I moved on. I haven't even spoken to her in weeks." Monroe didn't press, not yet. Instead, he leaned back slightly, shifting his tone. "I understand that divorce is tough. You had a lot to lose: your house, financial stability, and custody. That must have been hard." Michael's eyes flickered, a quick flash of something before he masked it with indifference. "I wasn't happy about it, but I accepted it. I had no choice." "No choice," Monroe echoed, nodding slowly. "I imagine it must have been frustrating, watching your ex-wife make decisions you didn't agree with, like changing her life insurance policy, for example." Michael's head snapped up at that, the first genuine reaction Monroe had seen. "What? You didn't know?" Monroe asked, tilting his head slightly. "Renee changed her beneficiary, removed you from the policy, left everything to the kids." Michael's expression darkened, but he quickly recovered, shaking his head. "That was her decision. I didn't care about the money." Monroe let the silence settle between them for a moment before speaking again. "Renee also told some of her friends she was scared. She felt like she was being watched." "Did you know that?" Michael scoffed, but it was forced, uneasy. "That sounds like paranoia." "Maybe," Monroe said, watching him carefully. "Or maybe she had a reason to be afraid." Michael didn't answer. His fingers tapped against the table just once, before he caught himself and folded his hands together. "You said you hadn't spoken to Renee in weeks," Monroe continued, "but phone records show you called her 4 days before she was murdered." Michael stiffened. "It was a short call," Monroe went on, keeping his voice steady. "Under a minute, but it happened. Want to tell me what that was about?" Michael exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "It was about the kids. We had things to figure out. That's all it was?" Monroe nodded, pretending to accept the answer, though he didn't believe it for a second. He flipped a page in the file, glancing at the notes taken from Renee's closest friends. "You ever threaten her?" Michael's eyes flashed. "No." "You ever say anything like, 'She'll pay for this,' or 'She'll regret what she did'?" Michael's mouth pressed into a thin line. "People say things when they're angry. It doesn't mean anything." Monroe leaned forward slightly, dropping the friendly pretense. "It does when your ex-wife ends up dead." The room went silent. Michael's fingers twitched slightly, his jaw clenched tight, but he didn't speak. Monroe watched him for a moment longer before pushing the file aside. "You know what I think, Michael?" Monroe said quietly. "I think you were angry. Angry that she got the house. Angry that she got the kids. Angry that she moved on, while you lost everything. And maybe, just maybe, you thought if you couldn't have control over her life, you'd have control over how it ended." Michael's face remained impassive, but something in his posture had shifted. He wasn't relaxed anymore. Monroe let the silence stretch before sitting back. "That's all for now," he said, standing. "But don't go too far. We'll be in touch." Michael didn't move at first. When he finally did, it was slow, deliberate. Without another word, he stood and followed the officer out of the room. Monroe exhaled, rubbing his temple. He hadn't expected Michael to confess. Not yet. But something in his reaction told Monroe they were looking in the right direction. Michael was hiding something. The problem was they didn't have enough to hold him. Not yet. Back at the station, Monroe met with his team, their notes scattered across the conference table. The forensic results from the crime scene were still pending, but there was growing evidence that Michael Pagel's alibi wasn't as airtight as he claimed. He told officers he was at home all night with the kids, one detective pointed out, tapping his pen against the report. But we have surveillance footage from a gas station 10 miles from his house around 11:30 that night. Someone driving a car that matches his. Did he pay with a card? Monroe asked. No, cash. But the timestamp lines up with a gap in his timeline. Monroe nodded slowly. Then we need to keep digging. If he left the house that night, we need to find out where he went, and more importantly, if he came back covered in blood. Across the room, another officer stepped in, holding a file. Preliminary DNA results just came in from the blood smear on Renee's doorframe. It's not hers. Monroe's stomach tightened. Then whose is it? The officer set the file down. They're still running it through the system. But if it's his, then we've got him, Monroe finished. The pieces were coming together, slowly but surely. If the DNA matched Michael, if the glove found outside the house had his prints inside, then it would be enough to bring him in for more than just questioning. Monroe looked at the board, at Renee's picture smiling back at him. They were close, and soon whoever had done this wouldn't be able to hide anymore. The morning air was crisp, a stark contrast to the weight of the case pressing down on Detective Monroe's shoulders. The sun was just beginning to rise over Rockford, Michigan, casting long shadows over the quiet streets, but there was no peace to be found in the Kent County Sheriff's Department. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense, the hum of conversation layered with the sharp clicking of keyboards and the rustling of case files. The murder of Renee Pagel had become the department's top priority, and every officer involved in the case knew they were running against the clock. The crime scene had already given them pieces of the puzzle: the lack of forced entry, the excessive violence, the small smudges of blood that didn't belong to Renee. But it wasn't enough. They needed something stronger, something that would tie the killer to the scene beyond a reasonable doubt. Michael Pagel remained their prime suspect, but without solid forensic evidence, they had no choice but to let him walk out of the station after questioning. Monroe had watched him leave, his movements slow, controlled, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. There had been no visible sign of panic, no breakdown, no careless words spoken in haste. If he was guilty, he was holding it together well. But the investigation was far from over. The forensic team had been working around the clock to process the evidence, and now finally the results were coming in. Monroe stood at the center of the department's conference room, where the case board had become a chaotic web of photographs, documents, and sticky notes marking key details. He flipped through the latest report as the lead forensic analyst walked him through the findings. The first piece of evidence was the latex glove found outside Renee's home. It had been partially buried in the bushes, as if someone had discarded it in a hurry. But the fabric had preserved more than just a bloodstain. Inside, pressed into the lining, were sweat and skin cells, more than enough for DNA testing. The lab had run it through the system, comparing it against known samples, and it had come back with a match. Monroe didn't even have to read the name to know what it said. Michael Pagel. The second piece of evidence was even more damning. The blood smear on the doorframe, the one they had been waiting on, the one that could finally place someone at the scene. It had taken longer to process, degraded slightly by time, but the result was unmistakable. It didn't belong to Renee. It belonged to someone else. It belonged to Michael Pagel. The weight of the findings settled over Monroe like a heavy fog. There it was, the proof they had been waiting for. The proof that Michael had been in the house, after the divorce, after everything had been settled, after he was supposed to be out of Renee's life. He had been there on the night she was killed, close enough to leave behind a trace of his own blood. The implications were clear. Whether it was a cut from the knife slipping in his grip or a scrape against the door in his haste to leave, it was physical evidence that tied him to the crime. Monroe set the report down, exhaling slowly. It was enough. Not just for another round of questioning, not just to cast more suspicion his way. It was enough for an arrest. Outside the station, The sky had shifted to a dull gray, clouds thickening as if the weather itself mirrored the mood inside. Monroe stood near the entrance, his badge clipped to his belt, watching as officers moved with a sense of purpose. A warrant had already been issued for Michael Pagel's arrest, and a team had been assembled to bring him in. They didn't know how he would react, whether he would cooperate or resist, whether he had already sensed that the walls were closing in. Monroe had seen it before, the moment a suspect realized that their carefully crafted world was beginning to crumble. Some fought, some begged, some stayed silent, calculating, waiting for their moment to twist the system in their favor. Michael, Monroe suspected, would be the silent type. The officers moved in quickly, descending on his home in an organized sweep. The neighborhood was quiet, no one outside except for a woman walking her dog, who stopped in her tracks when she saw the fleet of police cars pulling up in front of Michael's house. Within moments, officers had surrounded the perimeter, knocking firmly on the door before announcing their presence. There was a long pause. Then the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps approaching from inside. The door swung open, and there stood Michael Pagel, his face unreadable. He didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked like a man who had been expecting this moment. "Michael Pagel," the lead officer said, his tone firm. "You're under arrest for the murder of Renee Pagel." Michael barely reacted. His expression remained blank, his body stiff, as if he were processing the words in real time. He said nothing as they cuffed his wrist behind his back. Nothing as they read him his rights. Nothing as they led him toward the waiting squad car. But Monroe noticed something, the slight tightening of his jaw, the flicker of tension in his shoulders. Michael had been expecting this, but that didn't mean he was ready for it. As the car door slammed shut, Monroe turned toward the house, scanning the quiet, ordinary street. It was a strange contrast, the everyday normalcy of suburban life set against the backdrop of a murder investigation. Kids' bicycles leaned against front porches. A sprinkler hummed softly in a nearby yard. Someone's wind chimes clinked in the distance. And yet, within the walls of the Pagel home, something had unraveled long before Renee's death. Something that had ended in violence, betrayal, and now justice closing in. Monroe glanced back at the car, where Michael sat in the back seat, staring straight ahead, his face unreadable. There was still more work to do, more pieces of the puzzle to put together. But one thing was certain: the man responsible for Renee's murder was no longer walking free. The air inside the Kent County Sheriff's Department was thick with urgency. With Michael Pagel now in custody, the investigation had shifted gears. The pressure wasn't just about proving he was guilty. It was about making sure the case against him was airtight. A single misstep, a single gap in the evidence, and everything could unravel. Monroe had seen it happen before. Cases that seemed obvious, killers who walked free because the evidence wasn't enough. That wasn't going to happen here. The forensic team had already provided crucial breakthroughs, but there were still missing pieces. The most important? The murder weapon. The knife had never been found, and without it, the prosecution's case would be more difficult to solidify. The DNA evidence linking Michael to the scene was damning, but a weapon with his prints, his DNA, Renee's blood, that would be the final nail in the coffin. The department had issued a warrant to search Michael's home, his car, and any locations he was known to frequent. Officers combed through his belongings, checked his trash, scoured the drains for any sign of washed-away evidence. Nothing. The knife wasn't in his house. It wasn't in his car. If he had disposed of it, he had done so carefully. Monroe knew it was common for killers to throw weapons into bodies of water, rivers, lakes, anywhere currents could carry away forensic traces. There were several places near Rockford where that could have been done. If they didn't find the knife soon, they might never find it at all. But Monroe wasn't just focused on physical evidence. He wanted the full picture of Michael's movements. He instructed his team to go back through traffic cameras, gas station surveillance footage, ATM withdrawals, anything that could place him somewhere unexpected on the night of the murder. It didn't take long before something promising surfaced. A grainy but clear surveillance clip from a gas station, recorded just past midnight. A vehicle matching Michael's was seen pulling up to a pump, though the driver never got out. A few minutes later, the car drove off. He hadn't stopped for gas, hadn't gone inside the store. He had just sat there. It was strange behavior, and Monroe knew it meant something. Was he waiting for someone? Or was he figuring out his next move? More troubling still was the location of the gas station. It was nowhere near his house, nowhere near where he should have been if he was following his stated timeline. Instead, it was close to a riverbank, the kind of place someone might go to dispose of something they didn't want found. Monroe sent officers to search the area, dragging the river, checking for anything out of place. It was a long shot. If Michael had been careful, if he had weighted the knife, if the current had carried it away, they might never recover it. But it was a lead, and in a case like this, every lead mattered. Meanwhile, investigators continued looking deeper into Michael's behavior, before and after the murder. They combed through phone records, tracking every call, every text message he had sent in the days leading up to Renee's death. He had claimed he and Renee hadn't spoken in weeks, but the records told a different story. 4 days before the murder, he had called her. Less than a minute long, but long enough. Then another call. This one wasn't to Renee. It was to an unknown number, one not immediately connected to him. The number traced back to a disposable phone, the kind bought with cash and used when someone didn't want their calls to be traced. That wasn't something a man with nothing to hide would use. Even more unsettling were his search histories, retrieved from his devices. In the weeks leading up to the crime, he had looked up terms that made Monroe's stomach tighten. How to make a murder look like a robbery. How long does DNA last on fabric? Best ways to get rid of a weapon. Monroe had seen searches like this before. It was the kind of thing people did when they were thinking about a crime long before they committed it. The pieces were coming together, and with them, the timeline of what had really happened. The prosecution was already working on their strategy, preparing for what would be a difficult but winnable trial. The forensic team finalized their reconstruction of the crime scene, a chilling breakdown of what they believed had happened in Renee's final moments. She had been in bed, still weak from surgery. There was no struggle, no attempt to flee. The first wound had been deep, a fatal strike, but he hadn't stopped. Whoever had killed her had wanted to be brutal, had wanted to ensure she suffered, and the only person with a clear motive, opportunity, and forensic link to the scene was Michael Pagel. As Monroe reviewed the evidence, he knew they were close to putting the final pieces together, close to making sure Michael would never walk free again. But then, something unexpected happened. A new witness came forward, a man who claimed to have spoken with Michael just days before Renee was killed, and what he had to say would change everything. The walls of the Kent County Sheriff's Department were lined with whiteboards covered in scribbled notes, crime scene photos pinned in clusters, and timelines pieced together like a giant puzzle. Every officer working on the case knew one thing. The evidence against Michael Pagel was mounting, but the case was still incomplete. The DNA on the latex glove, the blood smear on the doorframe, and the inconsistencies in his alibi painted a damning picture. But they were still missing the murder weapon, and they still had to prove beyond doubt that Michael had premeditated this crime. Then came the unexpected. A man walked into the station, nervous but determined, asking to speak with a detective. He wasn't just a stranger looking for attention. His name was Beau Pagel, Michael's own brother, and he had a story to tell. Investigators sat with him in a separate room, recording his statement as he spoke carefully, choosing his words with the kind of precision that suggested he had been debating whether to come forward for a long time. He admitted that Michael had been acting strangely before the murder, restless and fixated on Renee. In the weeks leading up to her death, Michael had made dark, cryptic remarks, statements that, at the time, had seemed like nothing more than anger. But in hindsight, they sounded like a confession waiting to happen. Beau recounted a conversation they had in private, one that had stuck with him ever since. Michael had been ranting about the divorce, about losing everything, about how unfair it all was. At first, it had been the usual frustrations, the kind of complaints any divorced man might make. But then, his words had shifted into something more sinister. She thinks she's won, but she won't get to enjoy it for long. At the time, Beau hadn't fully understood what his brother meant. He had chalked it up to bitterness, thinking Michael was just venting. But then, after Renee was killed, those words took on an entirely different meaning. He couldn't ignore them anymore. More importantly, Bo had something even more valuable than just words. A few days after the murder, Michael had asked him for a favor, to help him get rid of something. A knife. A knife with a blade that still had stains he couldn't wash away completely. Bo had refused, disturbed by the request, but he hadn't reported it. Not until now. The statement sent a ripple through the investigation. If what Bo was saying was true, then the murder weapon was still out there, and Michael had tried to cover his tracks in a way that could finally prove premeditation. Detective Monroe wasted no time. A new search warrant was issued, and officers expanded the areas they had been investigating, zeroing in on locations where Michael had spent time after Renee's death. If the knife was still out there, it was only a matter of time before they found it. Meanwhile, the digital forensic team continued analyzing Michael's electronic footprint. His internet history, already suspicious, now revealed something even more unsettling. He had searched for information on how to clean a weapon, to remove DNA, and how to dispose of evidence in water. The gas station surveillance footage from the night of the murder placed him close to a river, and now, with Bo's statement, they had an even better idea of where to look. A team was sent to drag the river near the location Michael had been seen on camera. It was a painstaking process. Divers and sonar equipment scanning the murky depths for anything that might have been tossed in haste. Hours passed with nothing but debris and false alarms. But then, buried beneath layers of silt and weeds, something metallic caught the light. A knife. The blade was rusted but intact, the handle worn from exposure to the water. It was carefully retrieved, placed into evidence, and sent to the forensic lab for immediate testing. Monroe knew it would take time, but deep down, he had a feeling. This was it. While waiting for the lab results, Monroe focused on another angle: Michael's behavior after the murder. They compiled cell phone data, financial transactions, and surveillance footage to track his every movement. What they found only strengthened their case. Michael hadn't just gone about his life as usual after Renee's death. He had taken calculated steps to distance himself from suspicion. The day after the murder, he had driven out of town, staying in a motel under a different name. He had made large cash withdrawals, something unusual for him. It was as if he had been preparing for the possibility of needing to disappear. Monroe had seen it before. Guilt didn't always manifest as panic. Sometimes it looked like someone trying too hard to act normal. Days passed before the forensic results came back on the knife. The moment Monroe saw the report, he knew the case was about to reach its tipping point. The blade had traces of Renee's blood. Even after being submerged in water, some evidence had remained. Even more incriminating, Michael's fingerprints were still faintly embedded in the handle, proving that he had held the weapon. That was it. The case against Michael Pagel was now unshakable. Monroe sat in his office, staring at the evidence board, at the now complete picture of what had happened. Michael had planned this. He had thought about it, obsessed over it, taken steps to ensure it happened on his terms. But he had been careless in the aftermath, leaving behind just enough for investigators to trace back to him. They had the motive. They had the forensics. They had the murder weapon. And soon they would have justice for Renee Pagel. The final stretch of an investigation was always the most delicate. Every piece of evidence had been collected, every witness had been questioned, and every lead had been exhausted. But now came the true test, making the case airtight in court. The legal team was preparing for one of the most high-profile trials in Rockford's history, and Detective Monroe knew that even with all the evidence stacked against Michael Pagel, the defense would look for any weakness to cast doubt. The forensic team had already confirmed that the knife recovered from the river bore Renee's blood and Michael's fingerprints. The DNA on the latex glove found near her house was also his, proving that he had been at the scene. Surveillance footage placed him near the river hours after the murder, further strengthening the theory that he had disposed of the weapon himself. Even Michael's own brother had come forward, revealing that Michael had tried to enlist his help in getting rid of the evidence. It should have been an open and shut case. But Monroe had been in law enforcement too long to believe in easy victories. A case like this required absolute precision. The prosecution had to paint a clear picture, not just of what had happened, but why it had happened, step by step, in a way that left no room for interpretation. They had to establish intent, premeditation, and execution. The timeline had already been reconstructed with excruciating detail. Michael had been seen scouting Renee's neighborhood days before the murder. His phone records showed he had search methods for cleaning DNA and disposing of weapons. His surveillance footage placed him near the river after Renee was killed. His alibi had fallen apart under scrutiny, revealing gaps in his timeline that aligned with the estimated time of death. Then came the psychological evidence. Renee had confided in multiple people that she felt unsafe, that she believed someone was watching her. Her fears had not been irrational. They had been warnings. Michael's obsessive anger over losing custody, his bitterness over the financial settlement, his refusal to accept that Renee had moved on without him. These weren't just signs of resentment. They were indications of a man who felt he had lost control, and the murder had been about control. Michael hadn't just killed Renee. He had erased her in the most violent way possible, ensuring that even in her final moments, she would know he had the last word. The prosecution built the narrative of a desperate man, consumed by his own failures, who saw no other way to regain power except through violence. Monroe knew that when cases like this went to trial, the strongest argument wasn't just evidence, it was storytelling. The jury needed to feel the weight of what had been done to Renee. The trial began under the scrutiny of national media attention. Reporters packed the courtroom, waiting to hear how the case would unfold. The defense team had no choice but to acknowledge the evidence, but their strategy was clear. They would argue that Michael had been set up, that he had been at Renee's house for an innocent reason, and that his DNA was there simply because of past visits. They claimed that the knife in the river had been planted and that his search history was circumstantial at best. But they couldn't explain away everything. When the forensic expert took the stand, they methodically dismantled the defense's claims. The blood smear on the doorframe wasn't just a remnant of past visits. It had been fresh at the time of the murder. The knife, though weathered by the river, still held trace amounts of Michael's DNA, and the pattern of the stab wounds suggested that the killer had known exactly where to strike to inflict maximum damage. Then came the most damning testimony of all, Michael's brother, Beau. The courtroom fell silent as he recounted his conversation with Michael, how he had confessed to the crime in a roundabout way, how he had tried to get rid of the weapon, how he had let his guard down just enough to incriminate himself. The jury watched as Beau spoke, his voice steady but laced with emotion. He had wrestled with his conscience for years, but now he was making things right. Michael sat stone-faced, unmoving, as the prosecution laid out the final pieces of the case against him. When the closing arguments were made, there was no doubt left. Renee Pagel had been a woman who gave everything she had to others, who had spent her life caring for people, who had even given up a part of herself, her kidney, to save a stranger. And in return, she had been murdered by the one person who should have cared for her most. The jury deliberated for less than a day. The verdict was guilty. Michael Pagel was sentenced to a minimum of 25 years to life in prison, ensuring that he would never hurt another person again. But justice, as satisfying as it was, could never bring Renee back. The aftermath of the case rippled through the community. Renee's friends and family mourned her loss, knowing that no conviction could ever fill the void she left behind. Her children, now growing up without their mother, would have to live with the weight of what had been done to her. Yet her legacy remained. In the years that followed, a foundation was established in her name, dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence and raising awareness about warning signs of coercive control. Monroe attended one of the early events, standing at the back of a packed auditorium, listening as Renee's closest friends spoke about her kindness, her generosity, and the lessons her story had left behind. It wasn't just about her murder, it was about recognizing the red flags before it was too late. As Monroe walked outside that evening, the air was cool, the streets quieter than they had been the night Renee's life had been stolen. He thought about all the cases he had worked over the years, all the times justice had felt like a hollow victory, a legal closure that couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. But this time, something felt different. Renee's story hadn't ended with her death. It had become a lesson, a reminder, a warning, and maybe, just maybe, it would save someone else. The courtroom had fallen silent when the verdict was read, but outside the world kept moving. Justice had been served, but for those who had loved Renee, the sentence meant little compared to what had already been lost. Michael Pagel would spend decades behind bars, Yet the damage he had done could never be undone. The wounds he had left behind would not heal with time. They would simply become part of the lives of those Renee had left behind. Her children, now growing up without their mother, would carry this weight forever. The community, once untouched by such a brutal crime, had been forced to confront a reality they had never imagined. Friends and colleagues who had known Renee, who had worked alongside her and shared in her kindness, would always remember her not just for the way she died, but for the way she lived. In the years that followed, her story did not fade. Instead, it became something more, a call to action. A foundation was established in her name, focused on domestic violence awareness and prevention, ensuring that women like Renee would never feel unheard or unprotected. Her friends spearheaded initiatives to educate others on the warning signs of coercive control, the subtle ways in which manipulation turned into something far more dangerous. For Detective Monroe, the case remained with him, lingering in the back of his mind long after the trial had ended. He had seen countless acts of violence in his career, but this one had been different. Renee had been so close to escaping, so close to a new life, only for it to be stolen from her. If nothing else, he hoped that her story would serve as a warning, that no one should ignore the signs, that fear should never be brushed aside, that people should listen when someone says they feel unsafe. One evening, months after the trial, Monroe found himself driving past Renee's old neighborhood. The house had been sold, the new owners unaware of what had happened there. The street looked the same as it always had, quiet, peaceful. Yet he knew the truth. Darkness could exist anywhere, even in places that seemed safest. As he drove away, he knew that Renee's story was not just another case file to be closed and forgotten. It was a reminder, a lesson, and hopefully a reason for someone, somewhere, to escape before it was too late. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.